distinguished delegates, to the much welcome to this event on stepping up the UN's work on racial discrimination. We will focus today on the work of the UN Network on Racial Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. And I would like to start by giving the floor to Ms. Miwa Kato, Director of the Division for Operations of UNODC. Thank you, Miwa.
Thank you very much, Anna, for giving me the floor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues and friends, I am very pleased to welcome you on behalf of UNODC to this side event on stepping up the United Nations system's coordinated response to racial discrimination and protection of minorities towards effective, inclusive, and equitable law enforcement and criminal justice systems. A few months ago, you may recall that on the occasion of the International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that much of today's racism is entrenched in centuries of colonialism and slavery. It is time to acknowledge and repair long-standing wrongs, reverse their consequences. Reparatory justice is essential for reconciliation and the creation of societies based on fairness, equality, and respect. While the world has struggled and continues to struggle with the pandemic of corona, 2020 was also a wake-up call year for the world to address the legacy and the current realities of racial discrimination, including those that were exacerbated by the pandemic. In line with the Secretary General's commitment to address racism and promote dignity for all within the United Nations and in the work of the United System, over 20 UN agencies committed to reinvigorate the UN Network on Racial Discrimination and Protection of Minorities under the leadership of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, with whom we have the pleasure of co-organizing this side event today. UNODC has committed to taking the lead in the criminal justice pillar of the work of the network, bringing together core UN entities so that we can respond to the legitimate calls of the people around the world for ending violence and discrimination by law enforcement and criminal justice systems and provide equal access to justice for all, as member states have committed in Sustainable Development Goal 16. Ladies and gentlemen, crime prevention and criminal justice institutions play a key role in preventing discrimination, supporting victims to access justice, and to end impunity. The Commission on the Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice 2 years ago in 2019 already held a dedicated thematic discussion on the responsibility of effective, fair, humane, and accountable criminal justice systems in preventing and countering crimes motivated by intolerance or discrimination of any kind, where they shared experiences and made recommendations on this subject. Most recently, in the Kyoto Declaration, adopted by the 14th Crime Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice this past March, member states committed to, and I quote, ensure equal access to justice and application of the law to all, including vulnerable members of the society, regardless of their status, including by taking appropriate measures to ensure treatment with respect and without discrimination or bias of any kind by criminal justice institutions. UNODC is working to assist member states and is ready to step up its programmatic support work to respond to this important commitment, building on its existing program of work on police reform, crime prevention, criminal justice reform, and victim support and assistance. One of the important strategies in this regard is to build law enforcement and justice institutions that enjoy the trust of the population. and that are representative of the various groups within a particular society. You will be hearing today from Ms. Mona Rishmawi, the Chief of the Rule of Law, Equality and Non-Discrimination Branch of the Office of the High Commissioner, Professor Mehnat Peyande, member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, as well as my colleague, Ms. Anna Guidice, who serves as the focal point for the network in UNODC. I am looking forward to listening to their insights and also to hear the exchanges with member states and partners, what your expectations are from UNODC and the network, and how we can further commit to advancing this work together going ahead. Thank you very much, and once again, a warm welcome to this important event.
Thank you very much, Miwa. And I won't say much more because Miwa has already introduced the speakers. Thank you so much for your statement. And we would like to now listen to Ms. Mona Rishmawi, who, as you have heard, is the Chief of Branch in OHCHR. Mona, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and really good luck in the Congress. It's thank you, UNODC, for teaming up with us for this side event. This is really a very topical and timely issue. You know, we see all around us people rising up, calling for racial equality and racial justice. And we in the United Nations working on racial equality and racial justice is really not new to us. You will hear in a minute from from a member of one of our core treaties as the United Nations, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This is clearly one of the 9 most important human rights treaties that we have today, and I think my colleague will tell you it's one of the most highly ratified. It's one of the widest ratifications. It has received one of the widest ratifications in the world. This year we will be also commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. In September, we'll be holding a high-level event at the General Assembly with the participation of heads of states. So this is again another milestone for us to remark and talk about. In my intervention today, I'd like to bring to your attention some of the experiences or some of the observations we now have as a result of really talking to, I would say, hundreds of people of African descent in many countries, clearly not across the world, but I would say in a good number of countries, in the context of a report that the Human Rights Council has asked the High Commissioner to present in the aftermath of the very brutal murder and the killing of George Floyd in the US at the hands of, as we know, law enforcement officials. So the Human Rights Council met in an urgent session and asked the High Commissioner to study the issue in a comprehensive way and present a report to its June session. So the High Commissioner will be presenting a report in July, actually, because the session starts in June and ends in July. She will be presenting her report in July, and she will be putting forward some ideas about and how we can assist states to transform the situation, to change the situation. Frankly, I think all the people that we are talking to are saying we cannot just be counting bodies. That's really not acceptable. And with every killing, there are people go to the street and object, and then we go back to normal, and yet there is another killing. So we need to transform the situation. We need to commit to transformative change, and we need to acknowledge that this cannot continue as is. So I have three observations that I would like to bring to your attention as a result of the work that we've been doing recently. One big issue and that comes across, and it's really important to focus on, is racial stereotyping. A lot of people that we talk to say how people of African descent in particular, but racial minorities in general, are in many countries are associated with criminal activities, wrongly associated with crimes. Particularly with people of African descent, the legacies of enslavement, of transatlantic slave and colonialism really still lives with us and still paints the people of African descent in a very negative way. So pervasive racial stereotype and harmful practices and traditions have sustained and cultivated a tolerance for racial discrimination and inequality. And this has to be really has to be handled and attacked head on. Associating people of African descent, including migrants, with criminal activity is really not acceptable. I think some of the stereotypes that we kept hearing, these are big people, he's big, it's mostly he's big, he's dangerous, we cannot restrain him. We have to use extra force, and the extra force has been leading to, as we know, a lot of deaths and harm. Patterns tend to and trends across various countries show that violations against people of African descent occur at every stage that they encounter law enforcement in the criminal justice system. From the intervention of police in school disciplines to racial profiling by law enforcement in streets, to disproportionately high number of stops and searches of operations against Africans and people of African descent, as well as arrest and detention without bail to racial minorities, in addition to judicial bias leading to disproportionately high rates of sentencing and harsh punishment, including the death penalty. So we need to really work on these issues, which brings me to the second point that I want to talk about. I personally, and I think the research shows that that we cannot put it to the individual police, to police individuals and put it all to conduct and behavior. We have to accept that there is a level of systemic issues, there is a level of systemic bias that is happening in law enforcement. But training on bias is very important. Training to work on conscious and unconscious bias is really important. So, and that's my second point. So systemic racism often manifests in pervasive, as I mentioned, stereotype and prejudice and bias, infrequently rooted in histories and legacies of enslavement, which I already mentioned. What we need to do is really looking at what this bias is manifests itself, but also how it is dealt with. With rare exceptions, investigations and judicial decisions fail to consider the role of racial discrimination and institution bias that may have played in the deaths of people of African descent. So we are yet to come to terms with the fact that there might be disparate impact of policies and practices of different racial groups. And I think this is the group that is mostly affected is really the people of African descent. So training of conscious and unconscious bias is extremely important, but equally important is independent oversight and accountability processes that ensures that unconscious bias is addressed through vigorous operational policies, effective and continuous training and education. Addressing systemic racism in this point of view within the culture of law enforcement requires much deeper look than the behavior of each individual. It looks at the system as well as the behavior in individuals, and training is one component of this, but there is a larger issue that I would like to address as my third point, which is accountability. It is essential to address accountability for violations by law enforcement. Important element of the protection afforded to the right to life by the Covenant is to investigate and, where appropriate, prosecute the perpetrators of such incidents, including incidents involving allegations of excessive use of force. Unfortunately, our research shows that in very few of the cases that we have documented, and I tell you, we received up to around 300 cases in many from all over, from many countries, and some people say to us, you know, that this is just the tip of the iceberg, because in a lot of countries the cases are not even recorded. There is no data. There's no segregated data to show how the killings actually happen and the ethnic dimension of the killings. So this is a really big problem. So what we are also thinking about, and the convictions for these killings, or the association or the finding of guilt for these killings, is extremely rare. Therefore, what happened in the case of George Floyd, where it was extremely important, one has to admit and recognize it's a unique case. It's hopefully it's the beginning of something much more systematic and much more important, because at this stage it stands as exceptional that individuals are actually held accountable for the killings by law enforcement. Legal responsibility of superior officials must also be taken into account, because I think if the police and the law enforcement in general sees itself as a group of individuals that are also holding the human rights of people, then their instructions and the culture that they have and the policies and practices that they actually they elaborate must be also held around human rights standards. So even if the person is a superior and did not himself commit the act, the question is, what did the police do to prevent such acts? So the issue of prevention becomes extremely important in the policies and practices. And prevention is when every single case is taken seriously, and that there is an independent, impartial, and prompt, thorough, effective, credible investigation of each and every killing that comes to the attention. So data here is really important, and understanding the data is very important. Understanding how the impact of policies on different racial groups becomes really important. Within our human rights system, we have the Special Rapporteur on Racism, we have the Working Group on Experts of People of African Descent, and these mandate holders, the way we talk about them, do country visits, look at the practices and policies of different countries, and they actually receive complaints. So we do actually receive complaints from directly from people of African descent. One issue that came up as a result of these complaints is, as you may imagine, is how the people who are standing up against racism and the protests against for racial justice and against racial discrimination, how the protesters themselves have been handled. And what we have noticed is that for those who stood up against racism and for those who stood up for racial equality and justice, actually there has been heavy-handed measures that were used against them. We have to recognize that protest is a right, and standing up against racism is standing up for human rights. Of course, we are talking about peaceful protest here. We are talking about protest that respects the rights of others. But we have to remember that we are acting within a right, and a right that is protected by human rights law. I would like just to conclude now by just saying how it is a pleasure for us to collaborate with the UN system. We're extremely pleased that there are 22, I think, or now 26 actually, UN agencies who are joining hands together in the UN Network on Racial Discrimination and the Protection of Minorities. My colleague from UNODC already mentioned the work that the Secretary General and the attention that the Secretary General is putting to this issue. The Secretary General also is calling for internal policies. We recognize that we are also, as the United Nations, we are not immune. We have discrimination against between us, and we have discrimination in the system right now, and the Secretary General is putting a plan of action to help us as UN entities and as UN agencies to tackle this issue. So therefore, he is leading in a way to say that we need plan of actions, we need to admit that we have a problem, and we need to stop the denial and move forward. And I think he's leading the way in this regard. So I'm very grateful that we have this collaboration amongst agencies. We have embraced, as UN agencies, 8 work pillars, including leaving no one behind, around the SDGs, around protection, about criminal justice and intersectionality. Intersectionality is really a big issue that comes in our work. And we are extremely grateful for UNODC for this, for opening this space in the Congress for us to talk about this, the very important issue of racial justice, advancing racial justice. Let us put it positively, advancing racial justice through proper law enforcement and proper policing and proper action within the criminal justice system. So thank you very much, and I'm extremely happy to be with you and very happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Mona, and thank you for your leadership. I think you made so many important points on prevention, on accountability, on the need to look at structural issues, and of course on the link with the internal issues that the UN itself faces. I think 2020 and 2021 have really been a period of opening up some of the discussions that were not taking place both inside and outside of our offices. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Professor Mehrdad Payande, who is a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and a professor of law at the University of Hamburg, at the Bucerius Law School in Hamburg, Germany. The floor is yours, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. I'm very happy to present the general recommendation number 36 on preventing and combating racial profiling, as it has been adopted by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in November 2020. In the next 10 minutes, I would like to address 4 points. First, very quickly, the function of the general recommendation. Then secondly, the scope of the general recommendation and the understanding of racial profiling and the context of racial profiling that the general recommendation is based upon. Thirdly, I would like to very quickly point out the legal obligations that exist with regard to racial profiling. And then lastly, fourthly, highlight a little bit the specific recommendations that the committee has has developed in this recommendation. As you know, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has the mandate to supervise the implementation and the compliance with the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And the function of the general recommendation is, of course, to provide guidance and to assist states in discharging their obligations under the convention. In doing so, the general recommendation does not start from scratch, but it rather builds upon first the previous practice of the CERT with regard to previous general recommendations that touch upon aspects of racial profiling, as well as with regard to concluding observations that the committee has issued in the context of the state reporting procedure, where it has pointed out specific incidents, specific practices with regard to racial profiling in specific states. And secondly, the general recommendation does not only build upon the practice of the CERT, but it also takes up statements of a lot of other human rights institutions that have been made with regard to racial profiling, including the Human Rights Committee, the Human Rights Council, and there in particular, the Special Rapporteur on Racism and Xenophobia, as well as regional institutions such as the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Arab Human Rights Committee, or in Europe, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, or the Agency for Fundamental Rights. This leads me to the second point, a quick look at the scope of the general recommendation and the understanding and the context of racial profiling. The general recommendation is focused on racial profiling in the context of law enforcement, meaning in particular police officers, but also border control. And it looks at all different kinds of law enforcement action that is susceptible to racial profiling. So in particular, police stops, identity checks, seemingly random inspections. Here, I just want to highlight a few specific aspects or observations of the committee. The committee highlights that regularly specific groups are particularly affected by such incidents of racial profiling, in particular migrants and refugees, people of African descent, as has already been mentioned, and also ethnic minorities such as members of the Roma community, for example. It furthermore highlights that racial profiling is not only problematic from a legal perspective, but that it also has negative consequences. It weakens the trust of specific communities in law enforcement agencies and state institutions in general. It reinforces misleading stereotypes and conceptions, in particular of the relationship between crime and race or ethnicity, a problem that Ms. Rishmawi has already pointed out. And the committee then goes on and highlights the role of new technologies and of artificial intelligence in particular, and the role these developments can play in the context of law enforcement and how they can contribute to practices of racial profiling, for example, in the form of predictive policing or algorithmic profiling that is applied in the context of the judicial system, for example, when it comes to sanctioning or to determining the conditions for bail. This leads me to my third point, the legal obligations that are touched upon by the practice of racial profiling. And here I want to highlight three dimensions of legal obligations that stem from the Convention Against Racial Discrimination. That is firstly the central prohibition of racial discrimination as it is laid down in Articles 2 and 5 of the Convention. This prohibition, of course, prohibits the practice of racial profiling, but it also goes further in that it demands from states to review their policies and laws and also to actively take steps in order to prevent that their law enforcement officials engage in practices of racial profiling. This obligation, this prohibition of discrimination, is then complemented by the provision of Article 6 of the Convention, which demands that states, on the one hand, effectively protect against racial profiling, that is, take preventive measures, and on the other hand, that they provide for effective remedies when it comes to incidents of racial profiling. Here, the general recommendation highlights that the prohibition of racial profiling must be effectively enforced and that individuals must be enabled to seek reparation or satisfaction. And it also points out the importance of allowing for other means of enforcement, in particular collective enforcement, so that not only individuals that have been victims of racial profiling have the possibility of bringing a case and bringing an action, for example, in front of the courts, but that enforcement should also be open to collective actors, such as, for example, non-governmental organizations. And the third dimension of the legal obligations in the context of racial profiling concerns the obligation to combat racial discrimination through teaching and education, something that is, of course, highly relevant for practices of racial profiling, which are often not the consequence of malignant attitudes or open racism of individuals, but rather stem from structurally relevant systemic aspects of discrimination, as Ms. Rishmawi has also pointed out, with regard to the existence of stereotypes and biases. In this context, the committee emphasizes the importance of trainings for law enforcement officials, as well as other measures aimed at raising awareness. And this touches upon already my last point, the specific recommendations that the committee develops in the general recommendation. Again, the committee here doesn't develop these recommendations out of thin air, but rather based on previous recommendations, as well as based on strategies adopted by governments, state agencies, and civil society organizations. And I would just like to point out very quickly those 7 fields of action that the general recommendation touches upon. That is firstly, and as already mentioned, the legislative and other policy-oriented measures with the aim of providing an effective legal framework to combat and address racial profiling, which can include aspects such as internal guidelines for law enforcement officials, as well as oversight and audit mechanisms. Secondly, an important point that is highlighted is the importance of human rights education and training. With regard to raising awareness within law enforcement institutions, and here the committee also highlights the central role that national human rights institutions and civil society actors can play. Thirdly, the committee points out that recruitment measures are important, and here in particular measures that enhance the diversity of the law enforcement staff, which should then contribute to having less bias in decision making in a more diverse enforcement structure. Fourthly, the need to have a dialogue and means of interaction and communication between law enforcement agencies on the one hand and the communities that are affected by racial profiling on the other hand, with a view to enhance mutual understanding. Fifthly, the committee highlights the need for disaggregated data, as we've already heard. The lack of information on law enforcement practices and on actually practices of racial profiling is a big problem. So we need more data to actually identify where there might be practices of racial profiling in place. The next point, going beyond judicial enforcement, as it is prescribed by the convention, the committee highlights the importance of reporting mechanisms, both within and independent of law enforcement agencies. Here again, it is emphasized that national human rights institutions and civil society organizations have a big role to play in monitoring law enforcement practices and in raising attention and awareness of practices of racial profiling. And lastly, the committee points out the need for comprehensive measures to ensure that the use of artificial intelligence does not lead to human rights violations. The committee calls for regulation of the use of technologies, as well as the need to assess its implications for human rights and the prohibition of discrimination. The general recommendation then closes with a call on all stakeholders to further study the implications of the use of new technologies and artificial intelligence and of its implications for the principle of equality and the prohibition of discrimination, in particular, racial discrimination. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know it's a challenge to summarize such important work in so few minutes, but I think it was amazing to hear all of the points you made, and I'm particularly happy to have you here. I started my UN career with an internship at CERD, so it's good to be connected again. And as Mona has said previously, I think UNODC and OHCHR has been strengthening and building up its partnership more and more in the last years. And the statement of Ms. Bashley on Monday was also very important to the work of the Commission. So the link to the work of the CERD and the other institutions in Geneva is really something important. I will now change my hat to presenter and share a short presentation of the work of the pillar, which is, yes, I have 10 minutes, I believe. And again, if there are questions or comments, please, you can write them in the chat. I'm just, okay, sorry. So I hope you can see my presentation. So I don't hear anything, so I suppose that's a yes. So I will briefly talk about the work of the UN network and of its criminal justice pillar. As Ms. Rushmawi already mentioned, the the UN network has over 20 UN departments, agencies, programs, and funds, and it's led by the Office of the High Commissioner. It was created in March 2012 to provide a platform to address racial discrimination and protection of minorities through coordination and cooperation. It was quite active the first years and then less so. However, in 2020, with the developments around the world and also with the COVID pandemic and its impact on racial and other minorities, the network was revived, in particular with a meeting of senior level officials. Ms. Kato was there from UNODC, for instance, to discuss how to relaunch the network. We got a very strong support to continue working and increase the work of the network. There was also a decision to have a co-chairmanship, so OHCHR and UNESCO are currently co-chairing, and we've already heard that there are a number of pillars, each of which work with each other because many of the issues are cross-cutting. And additionally, I also wanted to mention that there is a strong link to the work of the SG's Task Force on Racism, and this was one of the messages from our senior management, which I think is a really important one, that we cannot address racial discrimination and protection of minorities in our programmatic work without addressing issues of racial discrimination in our own workplaces. So some tools developed by the network in the last years are the guidance note of the Secretary General that was published in March 2013. I recently looked at it again and it's still very relevant. We have also in 2020 produced a number of guidance and statements on the response to COVID-19. And more recently, in March 2021, we launched, or the High Commissioner launched, a checklist to strengthen UN work at country level to combat racial discrimination and advance minority rights. Another upcoming important tool coming out of the Leave No One Behind pillar, LNOB for UN colleagues, is an upcoming training for a number of UN country teams on these specific issues where all the different pillars are contributing. So what is the criminal justice pillar doing? The current members are UNODC, the Office of the High Commissioner, UNESCO and UNICEF, but other parts of other members of the network might be joining us. What are we planning to do? First of all, as you've heard, there are already a number of existing commitments. We haven't gone into details, but when it comes to criminal justice, we have the specific obligations under human rights law, and we also have many mentions in UN standards and norms of the importance to address discrimination. in the work of law enforcement and justice institutions. There are also, of course, the soft law commitments, such as various declarations, as well as what has been mentioned from, for instance, the Kyoto Declaration. Second, and I think this is what we're doing today and we have been doing in the last months, is to strengthen the link between human rights and criminal justice UN bodies. At the Crime Congress, we had participation of the chair of the working group of experts of people of African descent to a high-level event on equal access to justice for all. Ms. Dominique Day, who also addressed the Committee on Narcotic Drugs recently in Vienna. We are, of course, having this event, and there's been a number of statements also to various governing bodies of the network. Importantly, this is where we think that there is more work to be done in raising awareness amongst criminal justice professionals and officials on the existing framework, such as CERD, such as the general comments and recommendations from the human rights bodies, for instance, and vice versa. Some of the work being done by the UN Crime Commission and the Congress could be disseminated more strongly amongst human rights bodies. What are the thematic areas that we want to work on and that we're working on? First of all, to ensure access to justice for victims of racially motivated crimes. This links to the previous event on hate crime, and there is a specific commitment in the Doha Declaration on Hate Crime, Kyoto Declaration on Hate Crime. There was a previous mention as well in the Doha Declaration. We want to enforce and address structural discrimination in law enforcement and criminal justice, as mentioned, as the title of this event, towards effective, inclusive, and equitable institutions. And this will include disseminating and assisting in the implementation of the recommendation of the report of the High Commissioner to the Human Rights Council on Resolution 43/1. And we also want to mainstream anti-racist and intersectional approaches in crime prevention and criminal justice. There is not only specific programs focusing on police reform or on victim support that are relevant, but all of the work of UNODC and other actors in the crime prevention and criminal justice area, such as work, for instance, on smuggling of migrants and trafficking in human beings, which very much benefits from also taking an anti-racist and intersectional approach. What will we be doing? How will we be meeting these long-term goals? By knowledge generation, exchange, both with experts and with those most affected that have lived experience in this area, with professionals from law enforcement and from justice that have addressed the issue, by developing technical tools and providing technical assistance to countries through presences in countries, the UN country teams that I previously mentioned, and supporting them in assisting countries in adopting legislation, but in particular implementing legislation. And I think some of the points, again, that Mona made on the importance of police accountability, for instance, of the importance of oversight, of also justice actually doing its work, even when it relates to police officers having committed offenses, is essential, and it's something that we are to step up our work on. As some examples, UNODC is already working in this area in a number of countries. For instance, in Mexico, we've worked on, our office in Mexico has addressed this together with the Mexico City's Council to Prevent and Eliminate Discrimination. And they've started looking at the issue of racial profiling. Our office in Brazil is also working both together with UNDP and the National Council of Justice on the issue of pretrial detention. And in several states, on the issue of police oversight and monitoring of interactions of police with vulnerable youth. Those are just some examples, and I've probably gone over time, but thank you very much. And we will now have an intervention. Thank you. We'll now have an intervention from Ms. Imen Getiti, representative of the Permanent Mission of Tunisia in Vienna. Imen, are you there?
Yes.
Great. Welcome.
Good afternoon, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me the floor. Please allow me, first of all, to thank all panelists for their interesting and useful intervention, and UNODC for this important side event. And in this regard, I would like to take this opportunity to speak about the important step that has been taken by Tunisia, my country, on this issue through the adoption of the Organic Law number 15, 2018 of the 23rd of October 2018 on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. This organic law is the first of its kind in North Africa. It penalizes racial discrimination, and by recognizing the status of victim to those who suffer from racism, it enables them to take legal action and obtain redress. This pioneering law defines racial discrimination very clearly and in accordance with international standards, mainly the International Convention Against the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It provides for a specific procedure for victims of racial discrimination, allowing them easier access to justice. By adopting this law, the Tunisian state undertakes, on the one hand, to put in place public policies, strategies, and action plans aimed at preventing all forms and practices of racial discrimination, and on the other hand, to spread the culture of human rights, equality, tolerance, and acceptance of the other in society. In order to ensure the implementation of the provisions of this law, provision is made for the creation of a national commission for combating racial discrimination in charge of collecting and monitoring the various data, design and propose strategies and public policy. The decree number 203, 2021 of April 7, 2021 improved again this momentum launched in 2018. It concretizes the establishment of this commission by specifying its mandate, its members, and the organization of its work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Madame Getiti. I think it's so important to hear from different countries, and I think one lesson learned from the last months is that every country has to deal with this issue, and that each and every one of us has to address racial bias, racial discrimination, and inequality. I haven't seen any other comments or questions. I don't know, Mona or Miwa, if you would like to say a few last words. If not, this would be all for us. I would like to mention that we have one side event still tomorrow focusing on use of force and police accountability. I'll share the information in the chat as well. It is at the same time tomorrow, also on Teams. So I hope to see many of you there. Mona, would you like to say anything more? Thank you.
No, just really to thank you and to thank UNODC and to thank all the speakers today. I think it's, frankly, I feel we have an opportunity here. It's really, the time is right to put things in operation, to put things in practice, and to address historic injustices. Let's face it. This is one of the pillars of the injustices that our generation we are not responsible for it. So let's not make it worse for people. We have to address it and we have to move forward. So I'm really grateful. I'm really grateful for the work of you, of the various UN agencies. Tunisia, I'm very familiar of your law. It's excellent. I'm really glad that you mentioned it. So thank you so much for that. And of course, CERT's general recommendation is a star in the UN system. So please, 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 let's try. Claude, can you put a link to it, please? And it's I think it can be really helpful for people to see it. So thank you so much. That's been really great.
Thank you, thank you. Miwa, would you like to say a few last words? I'm not sure. Yes.
Thank you very much, and I'm also having to attend another meeting, so I'm sorry, but I did hear carefully all the interventions, and thank you very much. I think there's a lot of work to be done. I totally agree. The momentum is now, and I think we have a lot of ideas that we can follow up. So just to thank you once again for the collaboration, we appreciate, and I'm sure we will look into how we do this throughout the year, not just in the context of the Commission Week. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to the participants. Thank you to attendees, and we will share the information on the network. You can always contact us if you need anything. Thank you again, and have a nice afternoon.